At a fundraiser in Connecticut last night, President Biden made some of his most candid comments yet about former President Trump's criminal conviction. In off-camera remarks, Biden told the audience that a convicted felon is now seeking the office of the presidency. The president added, quote, "As disturbing as that is, more damaging is the all-out assault Donald Trump is making on the American system of justice." President Biden is reported to have said, quote, "Something snapped in this guy after the 2020 election," and, quote, "It's literally driving him crazy." Biden went on to call Trump unhinged, Joe. So maybe a private preview, Joe, of where we may see President Biden going publicly as his campaign rolls out now that Donald Trump has been convicted on 34 felony counts.
Right, it is, Jonathan O'Meara. It may be a private preview, but this is how Biden feels. This is how his campaign team feels. This is how people around him feel. They are glad the trial's over. They're glad that he's going out on the trail. And as I said yesterday, while that long stem winder of a press conference was going on Friday, the Biden campaign was celebrating. They said, okay, he sounds older, more unhinged, less connected with reality. This is why we want him out of the courthouse and on the campaign trail.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive, but they're exactly right. Some senior Biden people were eager for the trial to end because they felt in some ways it shielded Donald Trump from the scrutiny of the rest of the voters when then they actually hear him talking again. And he's in their living room again, which he was in that news conference on Friday, which he will be in the debate in just a few weeks' time. Americans will be repulsed when they don't want to go back to that Trump term. In terms of how the president and his team are going to handle this, it was previewed to me a couple of weeks ago. As we saw last week, President Biden's first words about the verdict were simply, we need to respect the process. The judicial system worked, and attacks against it are disgraceful. But now we're seeing other Democrats and the president himself begin to ramp up his attacks on Donald Trump. The Biden Twitter account more than a dozen times yesterday used the phrase convicted felon. We heard it again from President Biden last night. Now, they don't believe this conviction itself is a race-changing event. They do think, though, it will help along the margins and in a close race. That could matter. But more than that, they think it's just the latest piece, Willie, of this overall example they're building about how Donald Trump isn't fit for office. Look at the lengths he would go to keep power. Look how he's only out for himself and not you, the American voter.
Yeah, and given that this came in late May, this verdict, we'll see how long it can burn through a long campaign, whether it stays alive as a conversation piece. And Molly, you're writing about this in Vanity Fair. Molly's latest piece is titled Trump World's Post-Conviction Spin Cycle. In it, Molly writes this: while many Trump surrogates appeared to go about their messaging in lockstep, there were also some rather stark inconsistencies, suggesting Trump's verdict was not something that Republicans had a clear handle on. Perhaps the weirdest display of dissonance came from Mike Lee, who quite simply could not seem to make up his mind on whether the trial was a boon or a bust. At 5:15 p.m. on Thursday, the Utah senator tweeted that by pushing for and securing Trump's conviction, progressives have, quote, guaranteed Trump's election. But a mere 20 minutes later, the senator appeared to turn on a dime, saying of the trial, I can't imagine a bigger, more impactful contribution to the Biden campaign. A jury has found Trump to be guilty on 34 counts of falsifying business records. In his world, this reality does not really matter. It's something that can be endlessly spun and mangled and perverted into a word salad of projection and lies. But when it comes to wiping off a stain that is this indelible, Trump world is going to have a much harder time, writes Molly Jong Fast. Molly, let you expand on this a little bit on your piece. But obviously we heard reflexive reaction from most Republicans, not surprising at all, given a lot of them were at the courthouse during the trial to support him, saying that this was a miscarriage of justice and the criminal justice system is broken and the country is terrible and all those things because one time it cut against them. How do you expect this to play, though, for the rest of the campaign?
So it reminded me a little bit of the Access Hollywood tape. Like there was a moment of panic. It wasn't quiet. When the Access Hollywood tape broke, there was sort of silence and everyone was like, are we going to stick around with this guy? Obviously, Republicans are in it too deep to do anything but keep going. I mean, Donald Trump is basically the central platform of their 2024 campaigns. down the ticket. So I don't think that they're going to cut and run from him. And in fact, we saw lots of defending, but we saw a kind of very weird defending, right? So they would defend some things, but not other things. They attacked the rule of law, which is what we were expecting. I mean, a lot of it was this playbook, but there certainly was some tacking and weaving. And I also think ultimately Donald Trump is, when they're not completely in lockstep, that's something to look at. And so I do think there were some problems there. Ultimately, Trump was always going to say that this is what he expected and that this was how he thought it would go. But I think they really did think that he was going to skate, or at least skate on some of the charges.
Yeah, I mean, and they wouldn't have been alone. I was sure that there would be a possibility of a hung jury. Sure that maybe there would be one person out of the 77 million who voted for Donald Trump in 2020 that was on that jury that would not take their duty seriously. What I was wrong, and the Trump campaign was wrong. There were 12 jurors who were willing to set aside all pre-existing beliefs, all pre-existing prejudices, and just look at the facts of the case, follow the jury instructions, and convict him on 34 counts. Now, Gene Robinson, you're saying that there's something Donald Trump could do if he really wanted to make America great again, and there's about as much chance of him doing that as the Tories winning in a landslide next month. Why don't you tell us what he could do?
Well, no, he could withdraw from the race because he's just been convicted of 34 felonies. Imagine, Joe, if this were any other point in American history from the founding of the Republic till the day in 2015 that Donald Trump rode down that escalator at Trump Tower. At any other moment in our history, a candidate for any office who was convicted mid-campaign of 34 felony charges would have been out of the race before the jury foreman finished reading the 34 guilty verdicts, right? I mean, it would have just been automatic. It would have been unthinkable that someone would stay in any race given the status as a 34 times felon. But again, we're in this very different world. I thought, as I was sitting down to write a column yesterday, I thought, well, look, somebody needs to call for Donald Trump to step out of the race because, all these sort of, hand-wringing Democrats and chin-stroking pundits they've been calling for Joe Biden to step aside, and the only thing he's guilty of is living to 81. It's just, it's just this weird, topsy-turvy, upside-down world that we live in, and we need to stop every once in a while and realize this is not normal. This is not healthy. This is insane. And I kind of wonder if maybe that will sink in, just that fact of how insane and unacceptable this is, will sink in with some voters over time. We'll see.
I suspect it may with swing voters. We saw some polls over the weekend suggesting that it just may do that with independent voters, with swing voters, especially in the upper Midwest states. But Gene brings up such a great point, Willie. In the good old days, back when I was in Washington, I mean, heck, if somebody got indicted of 34 counts, they immediately resigned from Congress and went to prepare their defense. Here, Donald Trump gets convicted 34 times, 34 different felonies, and of course you have United States senators who are trying to use it as a badge of honor that their guy is being persecuted by the state.
Yeah, I mean, he's martyrdom, right? I mean, he's been compared to religious figures without irony by members of the United States Congress, by people on TV as a rallying cry behind him. And that's the Trump way, though, isn't it? Never surrender, never apologize for anything. Put your head down and keep moving and pretend, despite all the facts around you, that you are the victim.
And Always play the victim. I mean, that's
Yes.
always it. Always play the victim. Always play the martyr. You know, he was asked in this weekend Fox and Friends interview about evangelicals supporting him. We even saw people that used to be. I just saw shocking things by evangelical so-called leaders. One of them having Trump next to Jesus on a cross, saying, why wouldn't you vote for somebody who's been convicted? You worship somebody who was convicted. And that shows you just the depravity that many of these people are willing to sink to. It's just straight out blasphemy.
I was just going to say, there used to be a word for that, blasphemy. But Molly, the point of all this is that Donald Trump could not pull this off alone, right? He would be a convicted felon, and he would sound as insane as he does sound in that interview with Fox and Friends over the weekend for 90 minutes or however long it lasted. But the entire party, the entire media on his side rallies behind him and legitimizes his claims of victimhood.
And what was interesting this whole weekend was that the message out of Trump world was, this helps him. Right. We raised Gonzo money. Again, we're going to have to wait to see the filings, but it's still a lot of money either way. And he said, you know, this helps him. This makes him more powerful. You libs have done it now. Right. Even though, remember, it's a state case. And the other thing is that this doesn't exist in a vacuum. He has 3 other cases, plus all of these civil cases. I mean, this isn't just like one rogue prosecutor. I mean, the guy has done all of these things which have led to all these investigations. So, look, I think that to watch Trump world pump him up, both to try to play him as the victim and to also say that he must stay in because he is the only way that they're going to survive is a bizarre thing.
You know, there is such a bubble, too, Jonathan Lemire, that these people live in. I mean, and even people in sort of the media orbit that I've talked to, they think 34 felony convictions is great for Donald Trump, great for fundraising, firing up the base. Man, people are going to do whatever it takes to vote. It fires up his 44%, his 43%, you know, and ceiling maybe 46, 47%. But you know, they actually believe it. Trump knows better than to believe that this is something that he wants. But there are people around him that have convinced themselves, living in the bubble, that these 34 felony convictions, the greatest political advance for Trump in some time, and they're just completely delusional.
I mean, they're right that it'll fire up the base. They're right that it'll be good for fundraising, at least for the time being. But there's a couple of things here. First, we do know, as we've long said on this show, the way to know what Donald Trump's actually thinking is what he posts on Truth Social in the middle of the night. And it has been screed after screed after screed expressing anger and frustration at what has happened in these legal cases. And also, I've talked to people around him. He doesn't want to go to prison. He didn't want to be convicted. They had convinced themselves they would at least get a hung jury. They were surprised by the verdict, and particularly that it was unanimous. But even if this does help politically with his base, there's simply no way it helps beyond that. Now, Democrats feel there's worries already about complacency, that the members of the base will say, well, Trump's been convicted. He can't win. No. And that's why the overarching message from the Biden campaign immediately was he can still win, conviction or not. We've got to get out there and beat him at the ballot box. But it's about those swing voters. And in particular, as someone in the Biden camp put it to me yesterday, the people who are going to decide this election, the suburban voters, some of them older voters, they care about a couple things. And they care about democracy and they care about decorum. And they're just sort of turned off by the idea, the Biden people believe, that Donald Trump not only is now indeed a convicted felon, but the other part of that Fox interview over the weekend, Willie, was that he threatened retribution. Yeah. He said, we're going to use the Department of Justice to get back at the people who did this to me. And that, I think, is going to be upsetting to a lot of voters who are going to cast their ballots and actually decide this thing in November.
Yeah, kind of confirmed everything people believed about what's going to happen. I'm going to fire all the generals. I'm going to put in MAGA. We're going to have our own people in there. We're going to get rid of effectively the federal government and replace it with our own.